My name is Amir. I'm 34 years old, and on March 22nd, 2016, I did something that should have destroyed my life forever. I was a senior commercial pilot, flying for 12 years, a devout Muslim who had never questioned my faith. That day, at Atlanta Airport, I burned 3 Bibles in a maintenance dumpster, convinced I was defending Islam. I had no idea Jesus was about to change everything. I was born in Damascus, Syria, into what you might call the perfect Muslim family. My father, Hassan, was the imam of our local mosque, a man so devoted to Allah that he would wake at 4 a.m. every single day to prepare for Fajr prayer. My mother, Amira, taught Quran classes to young girls in our neighborhood. From the moment I could walk, I was surrounded by the call to prayer, the beautiful Arabic recitations, and the unwavering certainty that Islam was the only path to paradise. I was the son every Muslim family dreamed of having. While other boys my age were playing soccer in the streets or getting into trouble, I was memorizing verses from the Quran. By age 12, I had memorized over half of the Holy Book. My father would beam with pride when visitors came to our home, and I would recite entire chapters perfectly, my voice echoing through our modest living room. The elders would nod approvingly and tell my parents that Allah had blessed them with a special child. Ask yourself this question: have you ever felt the weight of being someone's perfect example? That was my entire childhood. I never missed a single prayer, not even when I was sick with fever. I fasted during Ramadan without complaint, even as a young boy when it wasn't required. I studied Arabic until my eyes burned, determined to understand every nuance of Allah's word. My friends sometimes called me too serious, but I believed I was storing up treasures in paradise. When other teenagers started questioning their parents' beliefs or rebelling against religious restrictions, I only grew more devoted. I would wake before dawn to join my father at the mosque, sitting cross-legged on the prayer rugs as he led the morning prayers. The discipline, the routine, the absolute certainty of right and wrong gave my life structure and meaning. I knew exactly who I was and where I was going. My dream from childhood was to become a pilot, not because I loved airplanes or adventure, but because I believed Allah had given me this vision. I would imagine flying above the clouds, closer to heaven, carrying faithful Muslims to Mecca for Hajj. It seemed like the most noble profession I could pursue. When I told my father about this dream, he smiled and said that if Allah willed it, it would happen. I studied harder than anyone in my class. Mathematics, physics, English, everything I needed to qualify for flight training. When civil war broke out in Syria, my family made the difficult decision to move to Dubai, where my father had been offered a position at a larger mosque. I was 17 then, and the move actually helped my aviation dreams. The United Arab Emirates had excellent flight schools and opportunities with international airlines. By 2004, I had earned my commercial pilot's license. The day I received it, I prostrated myself in gratitude to Allah, tears streaming down my face. Everything I had worked for was coming together perfectly. Within months, Emirates Airlines offered me a position as a junior pilot. I was flying international routes, seeing the world, earning good money, and still maintaining my perfect religious observance. The flight routes were amazing. Dubai to London, Dubai to New York, Dubai to Atlanta. I loved the technical challenges of flying, but more than that, I loved being in the air during prayer times. There's something incredible about praying at 35,000 feet, feeling closer to Allah than the people below. I carried my prayer rug in my flight bag and would find quiet corners of airports around the world to fulfill my religious obligations. Other crew members, especially the non-Muslim ones, would sometimes watch me pray with curiosity. Some asked respectful questions about Islam, which I was always happy to answer. I saw these moments as opportunities to share the beauty of my faith. I genuinely believed I was representing the best of Islam to the world. By 2015, I had achieved everything I had dreamed of as a young man. I was a senior pilot, respected by my colleagues, financially successful, and engaged to the most beautiful woman I had ever met. Fatima was the daughter of another imam in Dubai, a woman who shared my deep devotion to Islam. Our families had arranged our introduction, but we had genuinely fallen in love. She was intelligent, kind, and as committed to living according to Islamic principles as I was. We would spend hours discussing theology, planning our future Islamic household, talking about the children we would raise to memorize the Quran just as I had. Our wedding was planned for 2017, and I had already purchased a beautiful apartment near the mosque where we would worship together as husband and wife. Look inside your own heart right now. Have you ever felt like you had life completely figured out? That was me in early 2016. I had a perfect prayer attendance record. I sent money to support my father's mosque every month. I fasted not just during Ramadan, but additional days throughout the year for extra spiritual merit. I had completed Umrah twice and was saving money for a full Hajj pilgrimage. My family was proud of their successful pilot son. The community respected me as a young man who had achieved worldly success without compromising his faith. I was often invited to speak to young Muslim men about balancing career ambitions with religious devotion. I genuinely believed Allah had blessed me beyond measure, and I was grateful every single day. I had everything a Muslim man could want: a prestigious career, a loving fiancé, family approval, financial security, and what I believed was a guaranteed place in paradise because of my faithful observance. I was completely, utterly, absolutely certain about my faith, my future, and my relationship with God. Little did I know, the true God was preparing my heart for something incredible, something that would shatter everything I thought I knew about Him. March 22nd, 2016. I remember that date like it's burned into my memory, because it was the day I committed what I thought was a righteous act, but what would actually become the catalyst for the most incredible transformation of my life. I had just completed a routine flight from Dubai to Atlanta, my favorite international route. The 14-hour journey had been smooth, and I was looking forward to my usual 36-hour layover before the return flight. Emirates always house us at the same hotel near Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. After clearing customs and immigration, I took the shuttle to the crew rest facility within the airport itself. This was a quiet area reserved for international flight crews, equipped with sleeping quarters, a small kitchenette, and a common area where pilots and flight attendants could relax between flights. I had used this facility dozens of times over the years, without incident. I was exhausted from the long flight and looking forward to performing my Maghrib prayer before getting some rest. I pulled my prayer rug from my flight bag and began looking for a clean, quiet corner where I could face Mecca. That's when I saw them, 3 Bibles sitting on the small coffee table in the center of the common area. Not just lying there casually, but arranged deliberately, almost like someone had placed them there as a display. My immediate reaction was confusion, then irritation, then genuine anger. How dare someone leave Christian propaganda in a space used by crews from all over the world, including many Muslim countries? The previous crew rotation must have included some American or European Christians who thought it was appropriate to evangelize in our shared workspace. I felt personally attacked and deeply disrespected. I picked up the first Bible and flipped through it. It was a standard English translation with thin pages and a black leather cover. Someone had even highlighted certain verses and written notes in the margins. The audacity of it made my blood boil. This wasn't just some forgotten book left behind accidentally. This was intentional religious propaganda, placed where Muslim crew members would be forced to see it. Ask yourself this question: have you ever felt so certain about defending your faith that anger seemed righteous? That's exactly how I felt in that moment. I wasn't just annoyed by an inconvenience. I was genuinely offended that someone would contaminate our sacred workspace with what I believed were corrupted teachings. My father had taught me that the Bible had been changed and distorted over the centuries, that only the Quran contained Allah's pure, unaltered word. I gathered all 3 Bibles from the table, holding them like they were contaminated objects. My heart was racing with righteous indignation. I couldn't leave them there for other Muslim crew members to see. What if a young, impressionable flight attendant found them and started reading? What if someone's faith was damaged by exposure to these false teachings? I convinced myself I had a religious duty to remove this spiritual pollution. The crew rest area was nearly empty at that hour, most people either sleeping or exploring Atlanta during their layover. I walked through the facility carrying the Bibles, looking for an appropriate way to dispose of them. Simply throwing them in the regular trash didn't seem sufficient. These books contained false claims about God that could mislead people. In my mind, they needed to be completely destroyed, not just discarded where someone else might find them. I remembered seeing maintenance areas behind the terminal during previous layovers. Airport employees often took smoke breaks in these secluded spots, away from passenger areas. I took the elevator down to the ground level and found a service exit that led to the exterior maintenance section behind Terminal E. It was quiet back there, just a few dumpsters and equipment storage areas. The March evening air was cool and crisp. I found a large dumpster that was relatively empty and looked around to make sure I was alone. My hands were actually trembling, not from nervousness, but from what I believed was holy zeal. I was about to purify our workspace and protect other Muslims from spiritual deception. I pulled out the lighter I had purchased at duty-free for the cigarettes I occasionally smoked during long layovers. I opened the first Bible and held the flame to the corner of the pages. The thin paper caught fire immediately, creating a small but bright flame. I held the book carefully, making sure the fire consumed the pages completely before dropping it into the dumpster. The flames felt like purification. I was doing Allah's work, removing falsehood from the world, just as the early Muslims had removed idols from the Kaaba. The second Bible burned even more quickly. I felt a surge of religious satisfaction watching the highlighted verses and handwritten notes disappear in the flames. Someone had spent time studying this book, marking passages they found meaningful, but all of it was based on corrupted texts. I was freeing them from their delusion, even if they would never know it. The third Bible was slightly larger, with a hardcover that took more time to burn completely. I had to relight it several times to make sure every page was reduced to ash. By the time I was finished, there was nothing left but blackened remnants that I stirred with a piece of metal to ensure complete destruction. No one would ever be misled by those particular books again. I stood there for several minutes, watching the last wisps of smoke disappear into the Atlanta evening sky. I felt an overwhelming sense of religious accomplishment. I had defended Islam, protected other believers, and removed spiritual contamination from our environment. My father would have been proud of my decisive action to protect the faith. Walking back through the service entrance, I felt righteous and pure. I had proven my loyalty to Allah in a concrete way. This wasn't just prayer or fasting or charitable giving. This was active defense of the true faith against false teachings. I returned to the crew rest area feeling like a spiritual warrior who had just won an important battle. I laid out my prayer rug in the same spot where the Bibles had been sitting just an hour earlier. Now it was clean and appropriate for worship. I performed my Maghrib prayer with extra devotion, thanking Allah for giving me the wisdom and courage to act decisively. I asked for continued strength to defend Islam wherever my travels took me. After prayer, I called Fatima to tell her about my day. I didn't mention the Bible burning, but I did tell her how much I missed her and how excited I was about our upcoming wedding. We talked about our future children and how we would raise them to be strong Muslims in an increasingly secular world. I felt like the perfect Muslim man, defending his faith and planning a righteous future. That night, I went to sleep feeling completely justified in my actions. I had no guilt, no doubt, no second thoughts whatsoever. In my mind, I had done exactly what any faithful Muslim should do when confronted with false teachings. I was protecting not just my own faith, but the faith of every Muslim who would use that crew rest area in the future. Look inside your own heart right now. Have you ever been so convinced you were doing the right thing that you never questioned your actions? I was absolutely, completely, totally certain that burning those Bibles was not just acceptable, but required by my faith. I had no idea that the God I thought I was serving was about to reveal himself to me in the most shocking way possible, or that those flames I had lit would become the very catalyst for my complete transformation. The strange occurrences began exactly 48 hours after I burned those Bibles. March 24th, 2016, I was preparing for my return flight to Dubai, feeling refreshed and spiritually satisfied from my Atlanta layover. I had completed all my pre-flight checks, reviewed weather reports, and was ready for another routine 14-hour journey across the Atlantic. I had flown this exact route hundreds of times before, and I knew every detail of the flight path, navigation waypoints, and standard operating procedures. During the pre-flight inspection, I noticed the first unusual occurrence. The primary navigation system was showing inconsistent readings. The GPS coordinates were flickering between correct and wildly incorrect positions, jumping from Atlanta to coordinates that would place us somewhere over the Pacific Ocean. I called maintenance immediately, concerned that we might need to delay the flight for repairs. 2 maintenance technicians spent over an hour examining every component of the navigation system. They ran diagnostic tests, checked all connections, and even replaced several circuit boards. According to their equipment, everything was functioning perfectly. The test readings showed normal operation, but when I sat in the pilot's seat and touched the controls, the erratic behavior returned immediately. They had never seen anything like it. My co-pilot, Ahmed, was equally puzzled. He was an experienced pilot who had worked with me on dozens of flights. When he operated the same navigation controls, everything worked normally. The moment I took control, the system would begin displaying impossible readings. We finally decided to proceed with the flight using backup navigation systems, assuming the primary system had some intermittent fault that would be fully diagnosed after we reached Dubai. During the flight itself, the technical problems escalated beyond anything I had ever experienced. The autopilot system would disengage randomly, forcing me to hand-fly the aircraft for extended periods. Radio communications with air traffic control became increasingly difficult, with constant static and interference that only seemed to affect transmissions when I was speaking. Ahmed could communicate clearly, but my voice would be distorted or completely lost in crackling static. The instrument panel began displaying readings that defied explanation. Altimeter readings would suddenly jump by thousands of feet, showing us at impossible altitudes. Engine temperature gauges would spike into red warning zones, triggering alarms, only to return to normal readings seconds later. Fuel quantity indicators would fluctuate wildly, suggesting we were either completely empty or impossibly overfull. Ahmed suggested that I rest and let him handle the flight controls for a while. The moment he took over, all the instrument anomalies stopped immediately. Every system functioned exactly as designed. But when I resumed control, the problems returned with even greater intensity. We were forced to declare a precautionary situation with air traffic control and request priority handling, though we couldn't adequately explain what was wrong. Ask yourself this question: when does a pattern of technical failures stop being coincidence and start being something else entirely? I was a pilot with 12 years of perfect safety records, flying aircraft I knew better than my own car. These weren't normal mechanical problems or explainable equipment failures. Something was happening that went beyond any technical training I had received. The physical symptoms started during that same flight. I began experiencing severe headaches that felt like pressure building behind my eyes. My hands would shake uncontrollably when touching certain controls, making precise flying extremely difficult. I felt nauseous and dizzy, symptoms that had never affected me during any of my thousands of hours of flight time. Ahmed noticed my distress and offered to complete the landing in Dubai, which I gratefully accepted. After we landed, I immediately went to the airport medical facility for examination. The doctor performed a complete physical assessment, checked my blood pressure, examined my eyes and reflexes, and even ordered blood tests to check for any medical issues that might explain my symptoms. Everything came back completely normal. According to medical science, I was in perfect health. But the problems didn't end when I got home. That night, I experienced the most vivid and disturbing nightmares of my entire life. I dreamed repeatedly about books burning, but in these dreams, the flames were enormous and out of control. I would see myself trying to contain fires that kept spreading beyond my ability to manage. I would wake up sweating and terrified, feeling like something terrible was pursuing me. The nightmares became a nightly occurrence. Every single time I closed my eyes, I would see flames and burning pages. Sometimes the dreams were so intense that I would wake up smelling smoke, convinced that something in my apartment was actually on fire. I would search every room, checking for any source of the smell, but find nothing. The phantom smoke odor would linger for hours, making it impossible to return to sleep. My prayer life, which had always been the source of my greatest peace and strength, became increasingly difficult. During my 5 daily prayers, I found myself unable to concentrate. Instead of feeling the familiar comfort of communicating with Allah, I felt distracted and agitated. The Arabic words that I had recited flawlessly for decades would get jumbled in my mouth. I would forget verses I had memorized perfectly since childhood. Fatima noticed the changes in my behavior immediately. During our daily phone conversations, she commented that I sounded stressed and distant. When I tried to explain the technical problems with my flights, my voice would shake with an anxiety I couldn't understand. She suggested that I might be working too hard and recommended that I take some vacation time to rest and recover. I visited the mosque in Dubai seeking guidance from the Imam. I described my sleep problems and difficulties concentrating during prayer, though I didn't mention the specific technical issues or the Bible burning incident. The Imam suggested additional purification rituals and extra prayers to strengthen my spiritual defenses against whatever was attacking my peace of mind. I followed his advice meticulously, but nothing changed. The technical problems continued on every subsequent flight. It reached the point where other pilots began requesting not to be scheduled with me, concerned that my presence was somehow causing dangerous equipment malfunctions. The airline's safety department began an investigation into what they called unusual incident patterns associated with my flights. During one particularly frightening flight to London, the aircraft's electrical systems began failing systematically. Navigation, communication, lighting, and even basic flight instruments would malfunction whenever I touched the controls. We were forced to declare an emergency and make an immediate landing in Frankfurt. The subsequent investigation found absolutely nothing wrong with the aircraft. But the pattern was undeniable. Look inside your own heart. Right now, have you ever experienced something that made you question everything you thought you knew about reality? That's where I found myself by early April 2016. I was a rational, technically trained professional facing phenomena that had no logical explanation. Something was happening that went beyond mechanical failures or medical problems. I began to suspect that my disturbances might be connected to the Bible burning incident, though I couldn't understand why. I had done what I believed was right, defending my faith and removing false teachings. Why would Allah allow such problems to afflict someone who had acted to protect Islam? The thought that my righteous actions might somehow be causing these troubles was terrifying and confusing. The isolation became overwhelming. I couldn't explain what was happening to my colleagues, my family, or even Fatima without sounding mentally unstable. I was drowning in unexplainable circumstances, and every attempt to find relief through Islamic practices only seemed to make the situation worse. I had no idea that God was actually pursuing me with relentless love, preparing my heart for the most incredible encounter of my life. April 3rd, 2016. This was supposed to be a routine flight, Emirates flight EK217 from Dubai to Atlanta, the same route I had flown countless times before. I was piloting a Boeing 737-300ER with 247 passengers and 14 crew members aboard. My co-pilot was Sarah Mitchell, an experienced American pilot who had joined Emirates 2 years earlier. The flight plan indicated clear weather and favorable winds, promising a smooth 14-hour journey across 3 continents. During the pre-flight briefing, everything appeared normal. Weather reports showed scattered clouds over the Atlantic with no significant storm systems along our route. Air traffic control had cleared us for our standard flight path, and all aircraft systems checked out perfectly during ground inspection. I felt cautiously optimistic that maybe the technical problems that had been plaguing my recent flights were finally resolved. The takeoff from Dubai International Airport was flawless. We climbed to our cruising altitude of 39,000 feet without incident, and for the first 6 hours of flight, everything proceeded exactly according to plan. Passengers were settled, crew was relaxed, and all navigation and communication systems functioned normally. I began to hope that my nightmare of technical failures was finally over. As we approached European airspace, however, the problems returned with unprecedented intensity. Our primary weather radar began showing storm formations that didn't match any meteorological reports we had received. Air traffic control insisted that their radar showed clear skies along our route, but our instruments indicated massive storm cells directly ahead, some reaching heights of over 50,000 feet. Sarah tried to communicate with air traffic control to request a route deviation, but our radio system began producing the same crackling static that had plagued my recent flights. Control towers could hear her transmissions clearly, but when I attempted to communicate, my voice was completely lost in electronic interference. We were forced to rely on Sarah for all communications, while I focused on navigating around the storm systems that only our aircraft seemed able to detect. The weather deteriorated rapidly as we crossed into American airspace. What had been showing as scattered clouds on official weather reports suddenly became a massive storm front stretching from Georgia to Virginia. Atlanta Approach Control began vectoring aircraft to alternate airports as Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport experienced severe thunderstorms with dangerous wind shear and near-zero visibility. Our fuel situation became critical as we circled in holding patterns for over an hour, waiting for the storms to clear. Other aircraft were being diverted to airports in Tennessee, North Carolina, and South Carolina. But each alternate destination was also experiencing severe weather. We had approximately 25 minutes of fuel remaining when Atlanta Approach Control informed us that all airports within our fuel range were either closed or experiencing conditions below minimum landing requirements. That's when our navigation systems began failing catastrophically. The primary GPS showed our position jumping erratically across the southeastern United States. Backup navigation instruments displayed conflicting information, with some showing us over the Atlantic Ocean and others placing us somewhere over Texas. Our inertial navigation system, which should have been completely independent, began showing impossible readings that defied the laws of physics. Sarah was maintaining professional composure, but I could see the panic in her eyes as she realized we were essentially flying blind in the worst storm system either of us had ever encountered. The passengers were becoming increasingly frightened as severe turbulence tossed the aircraft like a toy. Flight attendants were struggling to remain calm while preparing for what appeared to be an inevitable disaster. I tried to contact air traffic control one final time, but our radio produced only static. We had no navigation, no communication, less than 20 minutes of fuel, and were flying through storm conditions that shouldn't have existed according to official weather reports. I was looking at the instruments, watching our fuel gauges approach empty, knowing that 261 people were about to die because of my inability to safely operate the aircraft. Ask yourself this question: have you ever faced a moment when you knew death was inevitable and there was absolutely nothing you could do to prevent it? That's exactly where I found myself at 11:47 p.m. on April 3rd, 2016. I was about to become responsible for one of the worst aviation disasters in history, and every system I depended on had failed simultaneously. That's when I heard the voice. It came through our aircraft's intercom system, clear and calm despite the chaos around us. The voice said simply, "Turn left, heading 180, descend to 8,000 feet. But here's what made it supernatural. The voice didn't belong to any crew member on our aircraft. It wasn't Sarah, it wasn't any of our flight attendants, and it certainly wasn't any passenger. The voice had an authority and peace that cut through my panic immediately. Sarah looked at me with confusion, asking if I had heard the same transmission. When I confirmed that I had, she checked our communication logs to see if air traffic control had somehow broken through the static. There was no record of any incoming transmission. The voice had spoken directly through our intercom, but there was no external source for the communication. Against every principle of aviation safety, I followed the instructions from the mysterious voice. I turned the aircraft to a heading of 180 degrees and began descending toward 8,000 feet, directly into what our instruments showed as the most severe part of the storm system. Sarah questioned the decision, but something in my spirit knew beyond doubt that we should obey the voice, regardless of what our failed instruments were showing. The moment I completed the turn and reached 8,000 feet, something extraordinary happened. Our navigation instruments suddenly stabilized and began showing consistent, logical readings. The storm that had appeared massive and impenetrable on our radar simply vanished, revealing a clear path directly to Atlanta's runway. Weather that should have made landing impossible suddenly became calm and manageable. But the most incredible moment was yet to come. As I focused on the instrument panel, trying to process what was happening, I saw something that changed my understanding of reality forever. For just a few seconds, but clearly and unmistakably, I saw the figure of a man standing beside my pilot's seat. He was wearing simple white clothing, and his presence filled the cockpit with overwhelming peace and love. I knew immediately, without question or doubt, that I was looking at Jesus Christ. Not Allah, not Muhammad, not any figure from Islamic teaching. This was the Jesus that Christians worship as God, the same Jesus whose word I had burned in that dumpster behind Atlanta airport just 12 days earlier. He didn't speak, but his eyes conveyed forgiveness, love, and a gentle correction that penetrated straight to my soul. The vision lasted only moments, but in that brief encounter, everything I had believed about God, religion, and spiritual truth was completely shattered. This wasn't a hallucination brought on by stress or fear. This was the most real experience of my entire life. Jesus Christ had personally intervened to save 261 people from certain death, and he had revealed himself to the Muslim pilot who had burned his sacred word. I'm telling you as someone who's been there, as someone who experienced the impossible firsthand. This was not imagination or wishful thinking. This was Jesus Christ, alive and real, demonstrating power over weather, navigation systems, and the laws of physics themselves. The God I thought I knew through Islam was nothing compared to the Jesus who stood beside me in that cockpit. The landing was perfect, despite conditions that should have made it impossible. As we touched down on Atlanta's runway at exactly 12:23 a.m. on April 4th, the storm cleared completely, as if it had never existed. Ground control was amazed, asking how we had managed to find the runway in zero visibility conditions. Passengers were applauding, thinking my piloting skills had saved them, but I knew the truth. I sat in the cockpit after all passengers had deplaned, my hands shaking uncontrollably as the magnitude of what had happened settled into my consciousness. I had just encountered the living God, and he wasn't who I had thought he was for 34 years of my life. Jesus Christ had saved us all, and in doing so, he had revealed that everything I believed about God was wrong. Sarah asked if I was feeling all right, noting that I looked pale and shaken. How could I explain that I had just met Jesus Christ personally? How could I tell anyone that the God I had served my entire life had just proven he was actually someone completely different? I was about to embark on a spiritual journey that would cost me everything I had ever known and give me everything I had never dreamed possible. The morning after the miraculous landing, I woke up in my Atlanta hotel room feeling like I was living in someone else's life. For the first time in weeks, I had slept peacefully without nightmares, but I was more confused than ever about what I had experienced. Part of me wanted to rationalize what had happened as stress-induced hallucination, but I knew in my heart that I had encountered something absolutely real and life-changing. I tried to perform my Fajr prayer as I had every morning for decades, but the words felt foreign in my mouth. As I prostrated myself toward Mecca, all I could think about was the figure I had seen in the cockpit, the peace in his eyes, the overwhelming love that had emanated from his presence, the authority with which he had spoken through our aircraft systems. This wasn't the Allah I had worshipped my entire life. This was someone completely different. Instead of returning immediately to Dubai as scheduled, I called in sick and extended my stay in Atlanta for 3 additional days. I told the crew scheduler that I was experiencing fatigue and needed medical clearance before flying again. In reality, I was desperate to understand what had happened to me and what it meant for everything I had believed about God. I found myself walking through the streets of downtown Atlanta, looking for answers I couldn't even articulate. I passed several churches and felt an inexplicable pull to enter them, though my Islamic upbringing had taught me that entering Christian places of worship was forbidden. Finally, I gathered enough courage to step inside a small Baptist church that had its doors open during the day. The interior was completely different from any mosque I had ever visited. Instead of Arabic calligraphy and geometric patterns, the walls were adorned with images of Jesus Christ. There were stained glass windows depicting biblical scenes, wooden pews arranged in rows facing an altar, and an overwhelming sense of peace that reminded me of what I had felt in the cockpit. I sat in the back row, trying to process the emotions flooding through me. An elderly man, who I later learned was the pastor, approached and asked if I needed prayer or someone to talk with. I was so desperate for answers that I found myself telling this complete stranger about my experience, though I left out the details about burning Bibles and my Islamic background. Pastor Williams listened without judgment as I described seeing a figure in white during our emergency landing. When I finished, he smiled gently and said, "Son, it sounds like Jesus revealed himself to you personally. That's not something that happens by accident. He's calling you to know him." Those words hit me like lightning, confirming what I had been afraid to admit even to myself. Pastor Williams gave me a Bible, the same type of book I had burned just 2 weeks earlier. I held it in my hands, remembering the flames consuming identical pages, and felt overwhelming shame for what I had done. How could I have destroyed something so sacred? How could I have been so wrong about who God really was? That night in my hotel room, I opened the Bible for the first time in my life with a sincere desire to understand its message. I had been taught that it was corrupted and unreliable, but after encountering Jesus personally, I needed to read his actual words for myself. I started with the Gospel of John, and by the 3rd chapter, I was weeping uncontrollably. The 16th verse stopped me completely. "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life." This was the opposite of everything I had learned about God through Islam. This spoke of a God who sacrificed for humanity rather than demanding sacrifice from humanity. This was a God of grace rather than a God of works and performance. I spent the entire night reading, comparing what the Bible said about Jesus with what the Quran taught about Isa. The differences were staggering and impossible to reconcile. Either Jesus was who the Bible claimed he was, the Son of God who died for humanity's sins, or he was merely a prophet as Islam taught. Both couldn't be true simultaneously. Look inside your own heart right now. Have you ever faced a moment when everything you thought you knew about life was suddenly challenged by undeniable truth? That's where I found myself during those 3 days in Atlanta. I was wrestling with the possibility that my entire worldview, my family's faith, and 34 years of religious devotion might have been directed toward the wrong understanding of God. The internal war was intense and exhausting. My Islamic training told me that considering Jesus as God was the unforgivable sin of shirk, associating partners with Allah. But my personal experience told me that Jesus Christ had personally saved my life and the lives of 261 other people through supernatural intervention that demonstrated divine power and authority. I called Fatima from my hotel room, desperately needing to hear her voice and feel some connection to my previous life. When she answered, I almost broke down completely. How could I tell the woman I loved that everything we had planned our future around might be wrong? How could I explain that the God we worship together might not be the true God after all? During our conversation, I found myself unable to pray with her as we usually did. When she suggested we recite Quranic verses together over the phone, I made excuses and changed the subject. She sensed something was wrong, but attributed it to work stress and fatigue from difficult flights. On my final night in Atlanta, April 6, 2016, I reached the breaking point of my spiritual struggle. I was alone in my hotel room, holding the Bible Pastor Williams had given me, and I knew I had to make a decision that would change everything. I couldn't continue living with the uncertainty and contradiction between my experience and my beliefs. I fell to my knees beside the hotel bed, not in the direction of Mecca, as I had done thousands of times before, but simply looking up toward heaven with complete desperation and honesty. For the first time in my life, I prayed to Jesus Christ directly. Jesus, if you're really who the Bible says you are, if you're truly God and not just a prophet, I need to know. I need you to forgive me for burning your word. I need you to save me. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The same peace I had felt in the cockpit flooded through my entire being. It was like every burden I had ever carried was suddenly lifted from my shoulders. The guilt from burning the Bibles, the fear of eternal judgment, the exhaustion from trying to earn God's approval through perfect religious performance, all of it disappeared in an instant. I wept like I had never wept before, not from sadness, but from pure relief and joy. I felt forgiven, accepted, and loved in a way I had never experienced through all my years of Islamic devotion. This wasn't the conditional love I had known, where God's approval depended on my performance. This was unconditional love that accepted me completely despite my failures and sins. In that hotel room, I surrendered my life completely to Jesus Christ. I confessed that I had been wrong about who He was, that I accepted Him as my Lord and Savior, and that I wanted to follow Him regardless of what it would cost me. I knew this decision would destroy my engagement, devastate my family, end my career with Emirates, and possibly even put my life in danger. But I also knew it was the truth I had been searching for my entire life. Ask yourself this question: what would you sacrifice for absolute truth? I was about to find out exactly what following Jesus would cost me, but I was also about to discover that what He gives in return makes every sacrifice seem insignificant by comparison. When I stood up from that prayer, I was no longer the same person who had burned Bibles 2 weeks earlier. I was a new creation in Christ, forgiven and transformed by the grace of God. I had no idea how I was going to navigate the consequences of this decision, but I knew beyond any doubt that I had finally found the true God I had been seeking all my life. The Muslim pilot who had burned Bibles in righteous anger had died in that Atlanta hotel room. The man who emerged was a follower of Jesus Christ, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead because he had encountered the love that changes everything. The cost of following Jesus became apparent the moment I returned to Dubai on April 7th, 2016. I knew I had to tell Fatima about my conversion before she heard it from anyone else, but I had no idea how to explain that the man she was planning to marry had completely changed his faith and worldview in a single week. I called her that evening and asked if we could meet in person to discuss something important. When Fatima arrived at my apartment, she was glowing with excitement about our upcoming wedding preparations. She had been shopping for her dress and wanted to show me photos of the reception venue her family had selected. Watching her happiness made what I had to do even more painful, because I knew I was about to shatter her dreams and destroy our future together. I took her hands in mine and told her I needed to share something that would be difficult for her to understand. I explained about the miraculous landing, about seeing Jesus in the cockpit, and about my subsequent conversion to Christianity. I watched the joy drain from her face as I spoke, replaced first by confusion, then disbelief, then horror at what she was hearing from the man she loved. Fatima's first reaction was to assume I was suffering from some kind of mental breakdown brought on by work stress. She suggested I see a doctor, take medication, get counseling, anything to return to my normal state of mind. When I insisted that I was completely rational and that my decision was final, her shock turned to anger, unlike anything I had ever seen from her. She stood up from my couch and backed away from me as if I had become contaminated with something contagious. "You have committed apostasy," she said, her voice shaking with rage and betrayal. "You have abandoned Allah for the lies of the Christians. You are no longer the man I fell in love with. You are dead to me." She removed her engagement ring, threw it on my coffee table, and walked out of my apartment forever. The next morning, I received a phone call from my father in Damascus. Fatima had called her father immediately after leaving my apartment. and within hours, both of our families knew about my conversion. My father's voice was cold and filled with a disappointment that cut deeper than any anger could have. He told me that I was no longer his son, that I had brought shame upon our family name, and that I should never contact any family member again. My mother refused to speak to me directly, but she sent a message through my father. I will mourn for you as if you had died, because the son I raised would never betray Allah in this way. The finality of her rejection was devastating. These were the people who had loved and supported me my entire life. And now they considered me worse than dead because I had found the truth about God. Word of my conversion spread quickly through Dubai's Muslim community. The imam at our family mosque called me personally, not to offer support or understanding, but to inform me that if I didn't recant my apostasy immediately, there would be serious consequences. He reminded me that Islamic law prescribed death for those who abandoned the faith, and while such punishments weren't officially enforced in the UAE, there were plenty of faithful Muslims who might take matters into their own hands. Emirates Airlines called me into a disciplinary hearing within a week of my return. While they couldn't legally fire me solely for religious conversion, they made it clear that my presence was no longer welcome. Other Muslim pilots had complained about working with an apostate, and several had requested not to be scheduled on flights with me. The company suggested that I might be happier seeking employment elsewhere, preferably in a non-Muslim country. I lost everything I thought mattered in the span of 2 weeks. My career was effectively over, my engagement was destroyed, my family had disowned me, my friends abandoned me, and I was receiving death threats from people who had once respected me as a faithful Muslim. I had to move out of my apartment because neighbors were harassing me and threatening violence. But here's what I discovered during those dark days. What I gained was worth infinitely more than what I lost. The peace that Jesus had given me sustained me through every rejection and threat. Where I had once found my identity in family approval, career success, and religious performance, I now found my identity in being a beloved child of God who could never be separated from His love. I'm asking you, just as someone who's walked this path would, have you ever experienced love that remains constant regardless of your circumstances? That's what I found in Jesus Christ. Even when everyone else abandoned me, He never left my side. Even when I lost my earthly security, I gained eternal security that no one could take away. During this difficult period, I met Pastor Williams again at the same Baptist church where I had first encountered the gospel. He introduced me to other former Muslims who had converted to Christianity and faced similar persecution. For the first time since my conversion, I found a community that understood what I was going through and could offer practical support during my transition. Through this Christian community, I met Sarah. Not the Sarah who had been my co-pilot during the miraculous landing, but Sarah Johnson, a flight attendant with Delta Airlines who had been a committed Christian her entire life. She was volunteering at a ministry that reached out to airline employees when we first met in late 2016. Unlike Fatima, who had loved me conditionally based on my religious performance, Sarah loved me for who I was in Christ. Sarah and I were married in a beautiful church ceremony in Atlanta on September 15, 2017, exactly 18 months after I had burned Bibles in that same city. Pastor Williams performed the ceremony, and over 200 Christians from around the world attended to celebrate with us. My biological family was absent, but I was surrounded by my new family in Christ, who had embraced me completely. Delta Airlines hired me as a pilot in early 2017, and I found that my new Christian faith enhanced rather than hindered my professional performance. The anxiety and technical problems that had plagued my flights as a Muslim completely disappeared. I flew with peace and confidence. knowing that my identity wasn't tied to my job performance, but to my relationship with Jesus. Sarah and I have been blessed with two beautiful children, Michael and Grace, who are being raised in the knowledge and love of Jesus Christ. When I watch them pray before meals or sing worship songs, I'm amazed at how natural their faith is compared to the religious struggle I experienced as a Muslim. They know they are unconditionally loved by God, not because of what they do, but because of what Jesus has done for them. In 2019, I was ordained as an airline chaplain, officially recognized, to provide spiritual counseling to airline employees of all backgrounds. This position has allowed me to share my testimony with thousands of pilots, flight attendants, and ground crew members from around the world. Many Muslim airline employees have approached me privately, curious about my conversion and hungry for the same peace they see in my life. The most incredible full-circle moment came in 2020 when I returned to the exact spot behind Terminal E at Atlanta Airport, where I had burned those Bibles 4 years earlier. This time, I was carrying a box of Bibles to distribute to airline crews. I stood in that same location, praising Jesus for his incredible grace and transformation. From Bible burner to Bible distributor, only God could orchestrate such a complete reversal. Over the past 8 years, more than 200 Muslims have accepted Jesus Christ through hearing my testimony. Airlines crews, mosque attendees who knew my story, and even some of my former friends in Dubai have reached out secretly to learn more about the Jesus who transformed my life so dramatically. Each conversion reminds me that God can use even our worst mistakes for his glory. Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself this question. What would it take for you to surrender everything to follow Jesus? I lost a career, a fiancé, a family, and a community. But I gained eternal life, perfect peace, unconditional love, and a purpose that transcends anything this world can offer. Jesus changed everything about my life, and he can change everything about yours too. I still pray 5 times a day, but now I pray to the God who loves me unconditionally rather than the God who demanded perfect performance. I still read sacred texts daily, but now I read the Bible instead of the Quran, finding comfort in promises of grace rather than threats of judgment. I still live my faith publicly, but now I share the good news of salvation rather than defending religious superiority. The Muslim pilot who burned Bibles in self-righteous anger no longer exists. In his place stands a man who distributes those same Bibles with humble gratitude, sharing the love of Jesus Christ with anyone who will listen. If God can transform someone like me, someone who actually burned his sacred word, then he can absolutely transform you, regardless of your background or past mistakes. Jesus is calling you right now, just as he called me in that Atlanta hotel room 8 years ago. Don't wait for dramatic intervention or miraculous signs. He's knocking on the door of your heart through this very testimony. Will you let him in and discover the love that changes everything? The same Jesus who saved 261 people from certain death is ready to save you for eternal life. All you have to do is ask him.